The door creaked open slowly, the faint glow from the hallway spilling into my room. My heart raced faster, the kind of panicked rhythm that makes your chest feel tight. I stared at the doorway, half expecting to see my mom checking in on me, even though she hadn't done that in years. But it wasn't her. It was my dad. I'll never forget the sound of the door creaking open that night. It wasn't loud. It was subtle, almost hesitant, like someone was trying not to wake me. At first, I thought it might just be the wind pushing the door ajar or one of those late-night creaks that old houses make. But then I saw the shadow. It was faint, just a silhouette against the dim glow of the hallway light filtering through the crack. My heart skipped a beat. You know that feeling when your body senses something before your mind can even process it? That icy grip of unease? That's exactly what I felt in that moment. I lay there, frozen, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just my dad checking on me, like he used to when I was little. But this time, it felt different. Something was off. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't the comforting, protective presence I used to feel when he'd peek in to make sure I was tucked in safe. No, this felt invasive. Wrong. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, almost suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and erratic, pounding in my ears like a drum. I wanted to sit up, to say something, to break the silence that was pressing down on me like a weight. But I couldn't. It was like my body refused to move, as though some deep part of me knew that whatever came next was going to change everything. And then, he spoke. Just my name. Softly, almost like a whisper. "Hey, you awake?" His voice was calm, too calm, like he was trying not to startle me. But instead of feeling reassured, my stomach twisted into knots. There was something in his tone I couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger or sadness or even worry. It was something else entirely, something that made my skin crawl. I didn't answer right away. My mind was racing, trying to piece together why he'd be standing there, in the middle of the night, speaking to me like that. Was something wrong? Did he need help? Or, no. I pushed the thought out of my head before it could even fully form. That couldn't be it. It couldn't. Finally, I managed to mumble, "Yeah, I'm awake." My voice sounded small, unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else. I hoped he'd hear it and just leave. Close the door and let me sink back into the safety of my blankets, pretend this never happened. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped inside. Every muscle in my body tensed. My room, my safe space, suddenly felt like a cage. The soft yellow glow of my bedside lamp, which usually made the room feel cozy and warm, now cast eerie shadows on the walls. I pulled the blanket up a little higher, as if it could somehow shield me from whatever was coming next. He sat down at the edge of my bed, the mattress sinking slightly under his weight. My mind was screaming at me to say something, to ask him what he was doing, but I just couldn't. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare, where you try to scream, but no sound comes out. And all the while, his presence loomed larger, filling the room with an energy I didn't understand, but instinctively feared. He started to speak, his voice low and measured, but I wasn't really listening to the words. I was too focused on the way he was looking at me. Not like a father looking at his child, but something else. Something I couldn't, or maybe didn't want to name. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I might actually stop breathing. And that's when I realized, this moment, right here, was the moment everything was about to change. The trust, the safety, the love that I thought defined our family, it was all teetering on the edge of a cliff. One wrong move, one wrong word, and it would all come crashing down. And the worst part? I had no idea what to do. No idea how to stop it. I wish I could tell you I knew how things were going to play out from there, but the truth is, I didn't. All I knew was that the man sitting on the edge of my bed wasn't the same man I'd looked up to my entire life. Something had shifted. Something had broken. And in that moment, all I could do was brace myself for the fallout. Growing up, my dad was my hero. He was the kind of man who always seemed larger than life. The type of guy who could walk into a room and instantly make everyone feel at ease. He had this way of making the world feel safe, like nothing bad could ever happen as long as he was around. When I was a kid, he'd fix anything that broke, a toy, a scraped knee, Even a bad day at school. He'd kneel down, look me in the eye, and say, "Don't worry, kiddo. We'll sort it out together." And he always did. I used to think there was nothing he couldn't handle. But as I got older, things started to change. It was gradual at first, so gradual that I didn't really notice until it was too late. The dad who used to chase me around the yard playing tag, who would sit for hours building model planes with me, started to drift away. He wasn't as present anymore. He'd come home later and later, his tie loosened and his eyes distant. The warmth I once felt from him, the laughter that used to echo through our house, began to fade. His once vibrant energy was replaced by a quiet heaviness that I didn't understand. And when he did speak, it was often with a sharpness that stung in ways I couldn't put into words. My mom, bless her heart, was too busy juggling the weight of the world to notice. She worked long hours at a job that demanded everything from her, then came home to a house that demanded even more. Most nights, she was too tired to see the cracks that were forming beneath the surface. I don't blame her for that, how could I? She was doing the best she could, just like the rest of us. But for me, those cracks felt like a chasm. I started to feel invisible, like I was standing in the shadow of a man I no longer recognized. He was still there, technically, but not in the way he used to be. The man who had once been my hero now felt like a stranger, and I didn't know how to bridge the gap between us. Looking back, I wonder if he felt it too, the distance growing between us, the slow unraveling of the bond we once shared. Maybe that's why he started trying to reconnect in ways that didn't make sense. Ways that left me feeling more confused and uneasy than ever. My mom and dad's relationship wasn't perfect. Whose is, really? But there was a time when it felt solid, unshakable even. They had this way of balancing each other out, my mom with her no-nonsense practicality, my dad with his easygoing charm. Together, they made our house feel like home. But over the years, even that started to shift. My mom's work consumed more and more of her time, leaving my dad to fend for himself in ways he wasn't used to. The once effortless partnership they shared began to feel strained, like they were speaking two different languages. I'd hear their arguments sometimes, muffled but still piercing through the walls. They weren't loud, screaming fights, more like quiet, cutting exchanges that lingered in the air long after the words were spoken. I didn't understand everything they were saying, but I knew enough to sense the growing divide between them. And then there was me, caught in the middle of it all. I felt like an outsider in my own family, watching from the sidelines as the people I loved drifted further and further apart. I tried to stay out of their way, to make myself small and unnoticeable. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was part of the problem. Maybe that's why, when my dad started paying more attention to me, I didn't know how to react. At first, I thought it was a good thing. He'd ask me how my day was, sit down next to me on the couch, and actually listen when I talked. It felt like a piece of the dad I used to know was coming back to life, and for a brief moment, I let myself believe that things might be okay again. But as the days turned into weeks, his attention began to feel different. It wasn't just the casual, fatherly interest I'd been longing for. There was an intensity to it that made my stomach twist in knots. He'd linger in my room longer than necessary, his gaze lingering in ways that felt unsettling. And then there were the conversations. They started out innocent enough, talking about school, my friends, the usual stuff. But gradually, they began to take on a tone that I couldn't quite place. He'd make comments that felt off. Not outright inappropriate, but just enough to make me second-guess myself. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that I was reading too much into things. After all, this was my dad. The man who used to hold my hand when I was scared, who taught me how to ride a bike, who always knew how to make me laugh when I was feeling down. He wouldn't hurt me. He couldn't. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The air between us felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that I couldn't ignore. And no matter how hard I tried to push it away, the feeling kept creeping back in, wrapping itself around me like a cold, unrelenting shadow. The man I used to look up to, the man I used to trust more than anyone in the world, was slipping away. And in his place was someone I didn't recognize, someone who made me feel uneasy in my own home. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to turn to. All I knew was that the cracks in our family were no longer just cracks. They were fractures, deep and jagged, threatening to pull us all apart. And I was standing right in the middle of it, desperately trying to hold it all together, even as everything around me was falling apart. That night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The faint hum of the TV downstairs had long faded, leaving the house in an unsettling silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet that wraps you in comfort. It was the oppressive kind, heavy with unspoken words and lingering tensions. My parents had argued again earlier that evening. Nothing explosive, just another one of their whispered exchanges that echoed through the walls like a haunting melody. I had tried to tune it out, stuffing headphones in my ears, turning the volume up just enough to drown their voices without drawing their attention. But even after the music had stopped and their argument had dissolved into silence, the weight of it still clung to me, settling over my chest like a thick blanket. I shifted under the covers, trying to will myself to sleep. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I kept replaying their conversation in my head, trying to piece together the fragments I'd overheard. Words like distance, resentment, and trust floated to the surface, each one sharp and cutting. And then I heard it, the faintest creak of the floorboards just outside my room. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but in the stillness of the house, it sounded as loud as a gunshot. My breath hitched, and my heart began to pound in my chest. For a moment, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the house was settling or the wind was pushing against the walls. But then it came again, followed by the unmistakable sound of the door handle turning. The door creaked open slowly, the faint glow from the hallway spilling into my room. My heart raced faster, the kind of panicked rhythm that makes your chest feel tight. I stared at the doorway, half expecting to see my mom checking in on me, even though she hadn't done that in years. But it wasn't her. It was my dad. He stood there, silhouetted against the dim light, his frame both familiar and foreign in that moment. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel his presence, a strange mix of comfort and unease that sent a shiver down my spine. For a second, I thought he might turn and leave, that this was just some fleeting moment of misplaced concern. But he didn't. He lingered, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe. I thought about closing my eyes, pretending to be asleep, but before I could, he whispered my name. "Hey, you awake?" His voice was soft, almost hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he should be there. But there was something else in his tone, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't the stern authority I'd grown used to, nor the playful warmth I remembered from my childhood. It was different. And it sent a chill through me. I didn't answer right away. My throat felt tight, like the words were stuck somewhere deep inside me. Part of me hoped he'd take my silence as an answer and leave, but instead, he stepped further into the room. The floor creaked beneath his weight, each step echoing in the stillness like a warning. "Hey," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" My stomach twisted into knots. What could he possibly want to talk about in the middle of the night? And why did it feel like the air had shifted, like the walls of my room were closing in on me? I pulled the blanket up a little higher, a feeble attempt to shield myself from the growing tension. "Sure," I mumbled, my voice small and unsure. I hated how weak I sounded, how vulnerable. But I didn't know what else to do. He sat down at the edge of my bed, the mattress dipping slightly under his weight. The familiar smell of his cologne drifted toward me, a scent that used to bring me comfort but now felt oddly suffocating. I shifted uncomfortably, trying to put some distance between us without being too obvious. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at the floor like he was searching for the right words. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, until I couldn't take it anymore. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound calm. He looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine in a way that made me feel exposed, like he could see every thought, every fear, every vulnerability. "Nothing's wrong," he said finally, his tone soft but tinged with something I couldn't identify. I feel like we haven't talked in a while. Really talked. I blinked, caught off guard by his words. He wasn't wrong, we hadn't talked much lately. But the timing, the setting, the way he was looking at me, it all felt off. Okay, I said cautiously. What do you want to talk about? He smiled then, but it wasn't the easy, carefree smile I remembered from my childhood. It was tight, almost forced, like he was trying too hard. I don't know, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Just life. How you're doing? If there's anything you need. The words should have felt comforting, but they didn't. They felt rehearsed, like he was saying them because he thought he was supposed to, not because he actually meant them. I'm fine, I said quickly, hoping to end the conversation before it could go any further. Really? I'm good. But he didn't move. He didn't leave. Instead, he shifted closer, his hand reaching out to rest on my shoulder. It was meant to be reassuring, I think, but it felt anything but. His touch was too heavy, too deliberate, and it sent a ripple of unease through me. You know you can tell me anything, right? He said, his voice low and steady. Anything at all. I nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in my throat. Yeah, I know. But in that moment, I didn't feel like I could tell him anything. I didn't feel like I could trust him. And for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't feel safe with my own father. My heart raced, thudding in my chest like a drum that wouldn't stop. My mind was spinning, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I overthinking this? Misinterpreting his actions? I wanted to believe I was, that I was just tired, that my imagination was running wild in the silence of the night. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. I felt a wave of panic rising, my breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. I wanted to ask him what he was doing, why he was in my room in the middle of the night, but my voice caught in my throat. What could I even say? How do you confront someone you've trusted your entire life when you're not even sure what's happening? The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to do something, to speak, to move, to end this unbearable moment. But I was frozen, trapped in my own fear and confusion. I glanced at his hand on my shoulder, his fingers resting there as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But it wasn't natural, not in this context, not with the way his presence filled the room like a dark cloud. My skin crawled under his touch, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't. It was like my body and mind were locked in a battle, one part of me too afraid to act and the other screaming at me to run. Are you sure you're okay? He asked, his voice soft but insistent. The concern in his tone should have been comforting, but instead, it felt like an interrogation, a way to keep me trapped in this moment. I nodded quickly, too quickly. Yeah, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm fine. But I wasn't fine. I wasn't even close to fine. Inside, I felt like I was unraveling, like everything I thought I knew about him, about our family, was slipping through my fingers. This wasn't the man who had taught me how to tie my shoes, who had held me when I cried after falling off my bike. This was someone else, someone I didn't recognize. A part of me wanted to cry out, to demand that he leave, but another part of me was terrified of what might happen if I did. What if I was wrong? What if I'd misunderstood everything, and my accusation shattered what was left of our fragile family? The thought of being the one to break us apart was unbearable. But then again, what if I was right? That thought hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless. What if I wasn't overthinking this? What if my instincts were telling me the truth, and I was ignoring them out of fear? The idea was too much to process, too overwhelming. I glanced toward the door, my mind racing with escape plans. Could I just get up and walk out? Would he stop me if I tried? I felt trapped, like a bird caught in a cage with no way out. And all the while, his presence loomed over me, his hands still resting on my shoulder like a weight I couldn't shake. I just want to make sure you're okay, he said again, his voice breaking the silence. You've seemed distant lately. The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. Distant? Of course I was distant. How could I not be, with everything that had been happening? But I couldn't say that. I couldn't say anything. All I could do was nod again, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But he didn't. Instead, he shifted closer, his hand sliding down to rest on my arm. It was a small movement, subtle enough that it could have been innocent, but it wasn't. Not to me. It felt deliberate, calculated, and it sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through my veins. "I care about you, he said, his voice low and steady. "I just want us to be close again." The words hit me like a slap. Close? What kind of closeness was he talking about? The way he said it, the way he looked at me, it didn't feel like the kind of closeness a father should want with his daughter. It felt like something else, something I didn't want to name. I wanted to scream, to tell him to get out, but I couldn't find the words. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy with fear and confusion. I was trapped in a whirlwind of emotions, panic, disbelief, anger, sadness, all crashing into me at once, leaving me paralyzed. Was this my fault? Had I done something to make him act this way? The thought made my stomach churn. I replayed every interaction we'd had over the past few weeks, looking for signs, for moments where I might have given him the wrong idea. But nothing made sense. Nothing could justify this. The silence stretched between us, thick and unbearable. I wanted it to end, but I didn't know how. And then, as if sensing my discomfort, he finally stood up. "I'll let you get some rest," he said, his tone casual, as if nothing had happened. But the look in his eyes as he glanced back at me before leaving the room told a different story. It wasn't a look of fatherly concern or love. It was something darker, something that made my skin crawl. The door closed softly behind him, and I was left alone in the suffocating quiet of my room. My hands were shaking, my heart still racing as I stared at the spot where he'd been sitting. The familiar shadows on my walls suddenly felt foreign, menacing, like they were closing in on me. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice, felt his hand on my arm. The questions swirled in my mind, relentless and unforgiving. What had just happened? And, more importantly, what was I going to do about it? Over the next few days, things felt different. It wasn't anything I could point to directly, no specific words or actions. But there was a shift in the atmosphere, something unspoken yet palpable. My dad's presence, once something I barely noticed in the background of my daily life, suddenly felt unavoidable, like a shadow that lingered just a little too long. His gaze became more intense, lingering on me in ways that made my stomach twist into knots. It wasn't the quick, passing glance of a father checking in on his child. It was something deeper, more deliberate, and it sent shivers down my spine every time I caught him watching me. I started to feel like a specimen under a microscope, constantly observed and scrutinized in ways I couldn't fully understand, but instinctively feared. His touch, too, felt different. A hand on my shoulder that lasted just a beat too long, a brush of his fingers against my arm that felt heavier, more intentional than it should have. Each interaction left me feeling trapped, my skin crawling as I tried to rationalize it. "It's just Dad being Dad," I'd tell myself, desperate to believe it. But deep down, I knew better. There was something about the way he moved, the way he spoke, that felt too controlled, too calculated. The worst part was how attentive he became. For years, he'd been distant, absorbed in his own world of work and whatever issues lay between him and my mom. But now, he seemed to take a sudden, almost overwhelming interest in my life. He'd ask me how my day was, not just in passing, but in a way that demanded detailed answers. He'd linger in the kitchen while I made a snack, watching me with an intensity that made the air feel heavy. He even started suggesting we spend time together, just the two of us. At first, I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that he was just trying to reconnect, to be the dad he used to be. But his timing, his tone, and the way he seemed to hover around me told a different story. It wasn't about fixing our relationship. It was about something else, something I couldn't fully name, but that made my heart race with fear every time I thought about it. One night, as I was sitting in the living room scrolling aimlessly through my phone, he came in and sat down beside me. The couch dipped slightly under his weight, and I felt the heat of his presence before he even spoke. "Hey," he said, his voice calm, too calm. "Can we talk?" The words hit me like a cold splash of water. My throat tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I glanced up at him, trying to read his expression, but his face was unreadable. His eyes, however, told a different story. They were intense, locked onto mine with a focus that made my skin crawl. Sure, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My hands clenched the edge of my phone, the smooth surface grounding me as I tried to steady my racing thoughts. He shifted slightly, turning to face me fully. The movement felt deliberate, as though he were preparing for something. I've been thinking a lot lately, he began, his tone measured, like he'd rehearsed this conversation in his head. About us. About how things have been between us. The word has hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. Okay, I said cautiously, not knowing where this was going but already dreading the destination. I feel like we've been distant, he continued, his gaze never leaving mine. And I don't want that. I want us to be close again. Again? The word close sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it, the way his voice softened, almost tender, in a way that didn't feel right. I shifted uncomfortably, pulling my knees up to my chest as a barrier between us. I think we're fine, I said quickly, hoping to end the conversation before it could go any further. But he didn't stop. I don't think we are, he said, his tone firm but still calm. I think there's a lot we haven't talked about. A lot I need to say. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I didn't want to hear what he had to say. I didn't want to know where this was going. But I couldn't bring myself to get up to leave. I was frozen, trapped in the tension of the moment. I care about you, he said, leaning slightly closer. The movement made my breath hitch, and I instinctively leaned back. More than anything. You know that, right? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My hands tightened around my phone, my knuckles turning white as I fought the urge to bolt from the room. You're special to me, he continued, his voice softening. More than you realize. His words felt like a weight pressing down on me, each one heavier than the last. My mind raced, searching for a way out of this conversation, but there was none. I was trapped, caught in a web of his words and my own fear. And then, as if sensing my discomfort, he reached out and placed a hand on my knee. The gesture was meant to be comforting, I think, but it wasn't. It felt invasive, wrong, and it sent a shiver of dread through my entire body. I stood up abruptly, the sudden movement breaking the tension like a snap of a rubber band. I think I'm going to bed, I said quickly, avoiding his gaze as I backed toward the stairs. He watched me go, his expression unreadable. Good night, he said softly, his voice following me up the stairs like a shadow. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling as I closed the door to my room and locked it. Leaning against the door, I tried to catch my breath, but it felt like the walls were closing in on me. What was happening? What was I supposed to do? The questions swirled in my mind, relentless and unforgiving, as I curled up on my bed and stared at the ceiling. I didn't have any answers, only the growing, suffocating sense that this was far from over. That night, the house was quiet again, but the silence felt heavier than ever before. It wrapped around me like a suffocating fog, pressing against my chest and making it hard to breathe. I was lying in bed, staring at the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through my curtains, trying to convince myself that everything would be okay. That I was overthinking. That I'd wake up tomorrow and all of this, whatever this was, would be a bad memory I could push to the back of my mind. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, that gnawing sense of unease that had been building for weeks. Something was wrong, and it wasn't going away. I heard the creak of the floorboards before I saw him. My body tensed instinctively, my breath catching in my throat as the sound of his footsteps grew closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that he'd just walk past my door. That he'd go back to bed and leave me alone. But he didn't. The door opened slowly, the faint squeal of the hinges cutting through the silence like a blade. I didn't need to look to know it was him. I could feel his presence, heavy and oppressive, filling the room even before he stepped inside. My heart raced, thudding painfully in my chest as I kept my eyes tightly shut, hoping he'd think I was asleep and leave. "Hey," he said softly, his voice low and measured. "I know you're awake." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My body froze, every muscle locked in place as fear coursed through me like ice in my veins. I opened my eyes slowly, my vision adjusting to the dim light as I saw him standing in the doorway. His silhouette was tall and imposing, his face obscured by shadows, but I could feel his gaze locked on me. "I need to talk to you," he said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. The click of the latch sent a jolt of panic through me, my stomach twisting into knots. "Can it wait until morning?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound calm. He shook his head, moving closer to the bed. "No," he said firmly. "It can't." I sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around me like a shield as I watched him take a seat at the edge of my bed. The mattress dipped under his weight, the movement sending a wave of unease through me. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his tone eerily calm. "About us. About what we mean to each other." The words sent a chill down my spine. My throat tightened, and I struggled to swallow the lump that had formed there. "Dad, I started, but he cut me off." "Please, just let me talk," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "I need to get this out." I nodded silently, my hands gripping the edge of the blanket so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind was racing, a whirlwind of fear and confusion as I tried to anticipate what he was about to say. "You're special to me," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You're not like anyone else. You're different." The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in from all sides as his words hung in the air. My chest tightened, and I struggled to catch my breath as a wave of nausea rolled over me. "I care about you more than I can put into words," he continued, his gaze locking onto mine. "And I think you feel the same way." The words hit me like a freight train, the weight of them crashing down on me with a force that left me reeling. My mind went blank, my body frozen in place as I tried to process what he'd just said. "Dad, stop," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. This isn't right." His expression changed then, a flicker of something frustration, desperation, crossing his face as he leaned closer. "Why not?" he asked, his tone almost pleading. "Who decides what's right or wrong? All I know is how I feel, and I can't ignore it anymore." My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud and erratic as I tried to find the words to make him stop, to make him understand. But before I could speak, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch sent a jolt of panic through me, and I pulled away instinctively, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Don't," I said, my voice breaking. "Please, just don't." For a moment, he looked at me, his face a mixture of hurt and something darker, something that made my stomach churn. "I just want us to be happy," he said softly, his tone almost pleading. "Is that so wrong?" "Yes," I said, my voice firmer this time. "It is. You're my father." The words seemed to snap something in him, and he stood up abruptly, the movement sending a wave of tension through the room. "Fine," he said, his tone cold now. "If that's how you feel." He turned and walked to the door, his footsteps heavy against the floor. But before he left, he paused, his hand on the doorknob as he looked back at me. "You'll see," he said, his voice low and steady. "You'll understand eventually." And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. I sat there, trembling, my heart racing as tears streamed down my face. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with betrayal and fear as I tried to process what had just happened. My entire world had collapsed in that moment. The man I'd trusted, the man I'd looked up to my entire life, had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And I knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, everything seemed painfully ordinary, and that was the worst part. The sun filtered through the blinds like it always did, casting soft golden light over my room, but it felt like a cruel mockery of what had happened the night before. My body was stiff, my mind foggy from a sleepless night spent replaying every word, every gesture, every horrifying moment. I felt hollow, like a shell of myself, and yet the world outside continued as if nothing had changed. When I finally worked up the courage to leave my room, the scent of coffee greeted me from the kitchen. My stomach churned at the thought of seeing him, but I couldn't stay locked away forever. The air felt thick as I stepped into the hallway, each step heavy with dread. There he was, sitting at the kitchen table with a newspaper in one hand and his coffee mug in the other. He looked normal. Too normal. Like nothing had happened, like the night before was just some fever dream I'd imagined. His calm demeanor only made my unease worse, amplifying the surrealness of it all. "Morning," he said, glancing up at me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I mumbled a reply, my voice barely audible as I grabbed a glass of water and retreated to the farthest corner of the room. I could feel his gaze lingering on me, and it took everything I had not to crumble under the weight of it. My heart pounded in my chest, the memory of his words echoing in my mind like a haunting refrain. He acted like nothing had happened, but I couldn't. I couldn't unsee the look in his eyes, the way his hand had brushed against mine, the way he'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I felt like a stranger in my own home, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboards, felt ominous, like a constant reminder of what I'd lost: trust, safety, and any semblance of normalcy. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and tension. I avoided him at all costs, timing my movements around the house to ensure we didn't cross paths. I stayed in my room as much as possible, the walls of my sanctuary feeling more like a prison with every passing hour. But no matter how hard I tried to stay out of his way, his presence was everywhere, an oppressive force that lingered even when he wasn't in the room. When I did see him, I couldn't meet his eyes. The very sight of him made my skin crawl, a visceral reaction I couldn't control. He, on the other hand, seemed unaffected, going about his day with a practiced ease that made me question my own sanity. Was it possible he truly didn't realize the weight of what he'd done? Or was this just another layer of manipulation, an attempt to gaslight me into thinking it wasn't as bad as it felt? My mom, oblivious as ever, didn't notice a thing. She was as busy as always, rushing in and out of the house, her focus on work and the endless demands of life. Part of me wanted to tell her, to scream the truth and let the pieces fall where they may. But I couldn't. The words lodged in my throat every time I tried to imagine saying them. What would she think of me? Would she believe me? Or worse, would she blame me? The thought of shattering what little stability we had left was too much to bear. And so I stayed silent, carrying the weight of it alone. The silence between him and me grew heavier with each passing day. It wasn't the comfortable kind of silence we'd shared when I was a kid, when words weren't needed to convey love and understanding. This was a silence filled with tension and unspoken truths, a silence that screamed louder than any argument ever could. He tried to talk to me a few times, but I always found a way to shut him down. A quick excuse, a sudden errand, anything to escape the suffocating feeling of being alone with him. But even in my avoidance, I could feel his frustration growing. It was subtle at first, longer stares, deeper sighs, but it was there, simmering just beneath the surface. The house itself began to feel like a battleground, every shared space charged with unspoken tension. The kitchen, the living room, even the hallways, they all felt tainted, like the walls themselves were bearing witness to the fracture in our family. My safe spaces were gone, and in their place was an overwhelming sense of vulnerability and fear. At night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the windows, sent my heart racing. I kept my door locked, the sound of the latch clicking into place providing the only semblance of security I had left. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough, that the lock was just a thin barrier against something far more insidious. I started avoiding home altogether, staying out late under the pretense of school projects or hanging out with friends. But no matter where I went, the weight of what had happened followed me like a shadow. I felt like I was living two lives, the one where I pretended everything was fine, and the one where I was drowning in fear and shame. My friends noticed the change in me, asking if everything was okay, but I brushed off their concerns with forced smiles and half-hearted reassurances. How could I tell them the truth? How could I explain something I could barely process myself? The isolation was suffocating. The person who should have been my protector had become the source of my fear, and the people I might have turned to felt impossibly out of reach. I was caught in a web of my own silence, each day pulling me further away from the life I'd once known. And through it all, he remained the same, or at least, he pretended to. He laughed at the dinner table, cracked jokes about work, and acted like the perfect husband and father. But every time he looked at me, I could see it, the glint in his eyes, the weight of his gaze that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't escape him. Not in the house, not in my mind, not even in my dreams. And as the days turned into weeks, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't something I could run from. It was a wound that wouldn't heal, a shadow that wouldn't fade, a truth that I couldn't ignore. And yet, I had no idea what to do next. The days turned into weeks, and yet the weight of what had happened sat on my chest like a stone, pressing down on me every waking moment. I kept asking myself the same question over and over again. Why me? What had I done to deserve this? Had I said something wrong? Had I unknowingly given him some kind of signal? The thoughts swirled in my head like a storm, relentless and unforgiving. But as much as I tried to make sense of it, there were no answers. The more I questioned, the more I realized the fault wasn't mine, it was his. My actions, my words, my existence, they didn't justify what he'd done. They couldn't. Still, knowing that didn't make the guilt go away. The guilt was insidious, creeping into every corner of my mind. It whispered to me in the quiet moments, feeding on my doubts and fears. If this was really his fault, why didn't you stop him? Why didn't you say something louder? Push him away harder? Run faster? But then, another voice, the one I was just beginning to find, reminded me, it wasn't your job to stop him. It was his job never to start. That realization should have been freeing, but instead, it left me even more tangled in my own emotions. Because now I had to face the bigger questions. What do I do now? Should I tell someone? Would they even believe me? The thought of telling someone filled me with dread. Who could I trust? My mom? She was the obvious choice, but every time I imagined the words leaving my mouth, my chest tightened with fear. What would she think? Would she believe me, or would she dismiss it as a misunderstanding? Worse, what if she blamed me? And even if she did believe me, what then? The thought of tearing my family apart was unbearable. Our family wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was all I'd ever known. What if telling the truth meant losing everything? What if it meant destroying not just my relationship with him, but hers too? Would she hate me for it? Would she resent me for ruining what little stability we had left? And then there was the other side of the coin, staying silent. Pretending nothing had happened. Burying it so deep inside me that it could never resurface. But the thought of that felt like a betrayal to myself, to the part of me that knew I deserved better. How could I live with myself, knowing what he'd done, knowing that I'd let him get away with it? I started to spiral, caught in a web of guilt, fear, and uncertainty. My mind was a battlefield, each thought colliding with the next in a cacophony of doubt and confusion. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Even the simplest tasks felt overwhelming, like the weight of my own body was too much to bear. I avoided mirrors because every time I caught my reflection, I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. The girl I used to be, the one who laughed easily, who believed in the goodness of people, who felt safe in her own home, was gone. In her place was someone I didn't know, someone who felt small, broken, and lost. But amidst all the chaos in my mind, there was one thing I couldn't ignore: the anger. It was small at first, a flicker of indignation buried beneath the layers of guilt and fear. But as the days went on, it grew, feeding off every memory, every lingering look, every misplaced touch. How dare he? How dare he take my trust, my safety, and twist it into something dark and suffocating? The anger was messy, tangled up with all the other emotions I was feeling, but it was there. And it gave me something I hadn't felt in weeks: strength. A small, fragile strength, but strength nonetheless. I started to imagine what it might feel like to tell someone, to take the weight I'd been carrying and place it in someone else's hands, even if just for a moment. I thought about the possibility of being believed, of being seen, of being heard. But with that thought came a flood of doubts. What if they didn't believe me? What if they told me I was overreacting, that I was blowing things out of proportion? What if they told me to just forget about it, to move on? The idea of that rejection was almost worse than staying silent. I began to write in a journal, pouring out the thoughts I couldn't say out loud. It became my lifeline, a place where I could be honest without fear of judgment. Some days, the words came easily, spilling onto the page in a torrent of emotion. Other days, I couldn't bring myself to write a single sentence. But each entry was a small step forward, a tiny act of defiance against the silence that threatened to consume me. The more I wrote, the more I realized how deeply this had affected me, not just in the immediate sense, but in ways I couldn't fully articulate. I'd lost my sense of safety, my ability to trust, my belief in the inherent goodness of the people closest to me. But I also realized something else. I didn't want this to define me. I didn't want to carry this weight for the rest of my life. And so, I found myself standing at a crossroads, torn between the fear of speaking up and the fear of staying silent. Both paths felt impossibly hard, fraught with unknowns and potential heartbreak. But I knew, deep down, that I couldn't stay where I was. I had to choose. As I sat in my room one night, staring at the blank page of my journal, I made a promise to myself. I didn't know when or how, but I would find a way to take back my power, to tell my story, to reclaim the parts of myself he had tried to take. Because no matter how much fear and doubt filled my heart, there was one thing I knew for sure: I deserved to be free. If you've listened this far, I want to take a moment to thank you for staying with me through this deeply personal and painful story. Sharing this wasn't easy. It's not something I ever imagined putting out into the world. But as I sat alone, carrying this burden, I realized I couldn't do it forever. I realized I needed to speak up, even if it was just to you, my audience. Now, I have to ask, have you ever been in a situation where someone you trusted betrayed you? Someone who was supposed to protect you, but instead left you feeling vulnerable, confused, and lost? How did you find the strength to move forward? I can't tell you how much I need your advice right now. If you've been through something similar, or if you've supported someone who has, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your words might just be the lifeline someone like me needs. And if this story resonated with you in any way, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about resilience, survival, and the strength it takes to move forward. Your support means the world to me and reminds me that I'm not alone in this journey. Before I end, I want to leave you with something that has been on my mind ever since this nightmare began. Trust is fragile. It's the foundation of every relationship, and when it's broken, especially by someone you've always relied on, it can feel like your entire world is falling apart. But here's what I'm learning: one small step at a time. The betrayal of someone else does not define you. You are not the sum of what someone else has done to you. You are more than their actions, their choices, and their failures. If you ever find yourself feeling unsafe, whether it's with a family member, a partner, or anyone you trust, please know that you deserve to be heard. You deserve to feel safe. And you are not alone. There are people out there who will believe you, who will stand by you, and who will help you through the darkest of times. Speaking up is hard, it's terrifying, but silence only gives power to the ones who hurt us. Finding the courage to speak, to tell your truth, is the first step toward reclaiming your life and your voice. Thank you again for being here with me, for listening, and for being part of a space where stories like mine can be shared without fear or judgment. Together, we can remind each other that, even in the darkest moments, there is hope, there is strength, and there is a way forward.